Our first speaker today is Dr. Patrick Connor from the University of Georgia. He is a professor and pecan and muscadine breeder with over 20 years experience at the University of Georgia. And he will be talking today about the most common and useful cultivars for muscadine production. Take it away, Dr. Connor.
Okay, let me, does this pull up the first slide on your screen? Okay, good.
Yes.
All right. So we're going to be talking about variety selection for vineyards or for muscadines. This is primarily influenced by what I've seen our growers in South Georgia using. And I would think that we would be fairly similar to Florida in terms of the varieties, which would be useful. There's some difference between what works in South Georgia and what works in North Carolina and Upper Georgia. And that's a lot influenced by the ripening time because they're about a month later than us when you get into North Georgia and North Carolina. Disease pressure does not seem to be as high in those regions as it is in South Georgia. And so I think Florida would probably be more similar to us in that your ripening time is in late summer when it's very hot, can be wet during that time of year. So there's a fair amount of disease pressure. We have one of the world's largest growers, Paulk Vineyards, which is about 40 minutes away from us here in South Georgia. And so things that have done well for them are things that I'm going to kind of highlight in this presentation. So let's just move off. I'll probably start the presentation talking about factors to consider when picking your cultivar. And then towards the end of the presentation, I will highlight the most useful cultivars that are being used currently. Okay, first thing you want to look at when you're choosing a muscadine cultivar, what you're going to see is they're going to be listed as either self-fertile or female flowered. Self-fertile is a bit of a misnomer for muscadine. It's not like they are self-incompatible. When they're saying self-fertile, what they're saying is it has a perfect flower in which it has both a functional pistil as well as functional pollen so that it can pollinate itself. Right now, the industry is mixed. Some varieties are female, about half the cultivars are female and about half are perfect flowered or what we call self-fertile. If you have a homeowner that's going to plant one vine, you need to make sure that they get a self-fertile vine. Well, you can plant a female vine and you may get some fruit. That'll only be if you have wild vines or neighboring vines which are self-fertile, which are happening to pollinate them. But usually you will not get very good yield with a single female vine. And so if you're only planting one, make sure they get a perfect flowered variety. This is what the flowers look like. The perfect flowered ones, they have a normal pistil, and then you have your anthers, which are held up by filaments, which are long, and the anthers will be above the stigma. And the female flower also will have the stamens and your anthers, but they'll be lower than the stigma, and your filaments here, they're recurved and short. And so that's how you tell the difference between a perfect flowered and a female flowered variety. Now the female will make pollen, but that pollen doesn't germinate and it's not functional in that way. First thing you want to look at picking a cultivar is what are you going to use it for? Are you going to use it for juice or are you using it for fresh eating? And really there aren't cultivars anymore that are suitable for both uses. Well, you can juice a fresh market cultivar. Generally, your yield isn't as high as a juice cultivar. So if you're only planning to use it for wine and juice, you're better off with a dedicated juice cultivar than trying to use a fresh market cultivar and juicing it. And then the quality of the wine juice cultivars are not suitable for fresh market muscadines anymore. North Carolina used to try and use Carlos, and they used to use it for both purposes. But really the fruit quality is just inferior in Carlos, and I don't think anybody's really trying to do that any longer. So For fresh market, you really need a dedicated fresh market grape. So wine juice cultivars, they were selected for high yields with a good brix. Berry size is relatively unimportant because you're just juicing them anyway. And skin toughness isn't a big deal in a juice cultivar. And so they tend to have a little bit tougher skin than your fresh market cultivars. If you're getting a fresh market grape, you want it to be large. In general, we like to have about at least an inch diameter in the fruit and weigh around 10 to 11 grams minimum. You want them to be firm. The packers and the grocery stores don't tend to understand muscadine. They judge them like regular grapes. A ripe muscadine traditionally is a fairly soft fruit. And when they see that in the store, they sometimes reject loads because they're ripe and they're soft and they're looking for a very firm fruit, like a vinifera grape. And so fresh market cultivars ideally would be still firm when they're fully ripe. And then you want a dry picking scar. You know, you're not picking them in clusters like a vinifera grape. You're picking them as single berries and then packing them usually in clamshells. If they pick with a wet scar, then that juice leaks out, and that's a problem. Flower type, the problem with the female vines, besides the fact that you need a pollinator, is your yields are just not as high with a female vine, and there's a couple reasons for that. One of them is a problem which we call capstick, and this is an example here of capstick. And normally, the calyptra sizes at the base of the pistil and then kind of pops off the top and exposes the stigma. When you get capstick, the calyptra dies and does not fully come off of the stigma, and kind of as it shrinks down when it desiccates, it really gets very firmly on top of that stigma. And when that happens, no pollen can reach the stigma, and so you do not get a fruit to form. And you can see, like in these clusters, really the majority, here's one that came off, but the majority of them have the capstick problem. Some varieties do this more than others, and some years is worse than others. And it really haven't really quite figured out what exactly is causing it in terms of either weather or variety, and why it's bad in some years and not others. But if you get a bad year, it can be severe, and you can really reduce your yield. The other thing is you have smaller cluster size in a female variety, and the wild vines are either male or female. The male clusters are larger, they have more flowers per cluster, and the self-fertile varieties are actually a mutant male, which reform the ability to form pistils. And so because it's more similar to a male plant, it has the bigger clusters. And so you have more potential berries for that. And then lack of pollination, of course. The female cultivars, if you don't have the self-fertile ones very close to them, they don't get pollinated fully, and you lose some yield potential that way. We found in general, the female cultivars are averaging usually around about half the yield that we get out of the self-fertile cultivars. And they're very up and down year to year in the yield you get on them. And so our growers prefer to have perfect flowered cultivars, and our breeding program is only releasing perfect flowered cultivars currently. But you do still see quite a few female vines for sale, and you see a fair amount of them in the vineyard. And the reason for that used to be that traditionally the female varieties are larger than berry size than are the perfect flowered varieties. In the past, the maximum berry size in the perfect flowered was about 10 to 11 grams, whereas the very large female varieties could be 15 to 16 grams in berry size. And so to get that very large size, growers were forced to plant the female varieties. But now we're starting to release some new cultivars which have the perfect flowers and do have the 15-gram berry size. And so I think as those get to be more common, we're going to be seeing less and less of the female varieties being planted. Berry size, again, self-fertile cultivars are usually smaller, but they tend to be more consistent in size. Female varieties, if it's fully pollinated, there'll be 3 or 4 seeds in the berry. The seeds trigger the berry to get to be full size. Whereas if you only have 1 seed in the berry, it may be smaller. And then you oftentimes get some parthenocarpic fruit, which don't have any seeds at all, which is very small. And so you get kind of a mix with a female variety with very big berries like this, and then some somewhat smaller berries. Whereas the perfect flowered varieties, because they have the pollen right there, they tend to always have 3 to 4 seeds per berry and be very consistent berry to berry in size. Generally for fresh market use, we like to see a 10 to 11 gram berry minimum and 1 inch diameter. And those are usually sold in clamshells. But some growers also sell them in like a cardboard packing box where the consumer would reach in and pick out the berries and put them in a bag. And oftentimes, if you're selling them that way, they like to have the bigger size berry, like a 15 gram berry, because it just has more eye appeal when you're seeing them in a box like that. The new self-fertile cultivars, POC, Ruby Crisp, are about 15 grams, so they're nearly as big as the biggest female cultivars. But most of the other self-fertile cultivars are still in that 10 to 11 gram berry size, which is good enough for the clamshells, but maybe not quite as good for the boxed berries. Important, if you're using them for fresh market, is dry stem scars and the firm flesh. When you're picking them, you oftentimes will get split in some cultivars like this, and that's what's called a wet scar. This will leak out juice. If you try to store them, they will desiccate and get soft. The juice tends to get mold growing on them, and you can get mold in the box. And it just gets very unappealing. If the consumers are pulling them out by hand and the berries are sticky, that's not good either. And some varieties, they'll have, up to a third of the berries have a wet scar. Generally, you can't box those for clamshell sales when they split this badly. And so you have to throw them in and either juice them, or a lot of growers now are packing and putting them in the clamshells in the field. And so if they were too wet, they would have to just be thrown on the ground. And so you'd lose that. And so your effective yield is much lower if you're getting a lot of this berry split. You can reduce that by picking later in the day, so you don't have as much turgidity in the berries, and not picking right after a rain event. But you can't always do that and still get everything picked. And so it's better if you can find varieties which have a drier scar. Final thing you want to look at is disease resistance and vine vigor. There's several cultivars out there right now that don't have optimum vine vigor, and that can be a problem. I think it'd probably be maybe a little bit bigger problem in Florida with the somewhat sandier soils. And then disease resistance is primarily a factor of berry color. The purple and black berries are much more disease resistant than are the bronze cultivars. If you're planting the bronze, they're susceptible to soft rots, which can infect the berry when they're younger, but you usually don't see evidence of it until the berries start to ripen. And so berries that look fairly good going into the harvest season can quickly develop these soft rots, especially if you're in the coastal plain or south of that in Florida, where you're getting a lot of hot, rainy weather during the harvest season. Then these soft rots can really explode on the bronze berries. And one of the problems is that some of our better fungicides have a 14-day pre-harvest interval. And so you're not able to spray them and keep that spray on them when you're picking them for harvest. And that's when you really need to be able to continue that fungicide control. So that's a problem. So if you have the ability to grow either color, you try to concentrate on the purple ones if you're in these regions where the disease is a problem. I would, really, it's so much easier to grow them. The problem is that some consumers really do prefer the bronze varieties, and the grocery stores often want both bronze and purple. And so you may not be able to get away from growing the bronze, but I would probably plant more of the purple than I did the bronze, and see if you can sell those, because they'll be much easier to control the soft rots in them. So in terms of what we recommend, I kind of split these into bronze or black to discuss the varieties. And then we look at 3 seasons, harvest seasons: early, mid, and late. South Georgia, early, I consider the last week of July, first week of August. Mid would be the second and third week of August, and then late would be the last week of August, first week of September. So just kind of go through these from early to late. There's not a lot of good early season black Muscadine varieties out there. And your 2 options are is Lane, which is our first release. It's a self-fertile black. And then your other option for early black is to plant Supreme, which is very variable in ripening. You'll get fully ripe berries in the cluster right next to green berries. And so if you plant Supreme, if you're willing to go over them and pick them and find the ripe ones, you can get some early harvest out of Supreme doing that. Lane's a little easier to pick because they tend to ripen all at the same time, and we're usually able to pick them the last week of July, maybe the first week of August, depending on the year. Size is similar to the other self-fertile cultivars, 9 to 10 grams, not as big as Supreme. Berries, very firm flesh, and they hold on the vine quite well. And they tend to have very high bricks early in the season, so that makes them a really good early season cultivar. We can have issues with wet scars, especially if you pick them right after a rain. And so that's a little bit of a problem with Lane. It's a little bit fussier on when you can harvest it. What we're recommending for Lane is to only plant enough Lane to do your early season market. It has relatively low to moderate yields, and it definitely has lower vigor than some other varieties. And so it's kind of fussy to grow. And that, in addition with the somewhat high stem split when you pick it, I don't consider it a good main season cultivar because of those problems. So I wouldn't plant any more than, a quarter of your black acreage, and I'd probably put less than that into Lane, and just see how it works for you in your production. And then transition over to Supreme and Pawk for your main season production. Supreme is a main season black cultivar. It's probably the most popular commercial fresh market cultivar right now. And if I were starting a business and packing it out for grocery stores, it would be my main variety. Excellent size. It's about 15, 16 grams, quite large. Excellent fruit firmness. So a fully ripe Supreme is still a firm berry. So the grocery stores are going to like that firmness. And the berries hold that firmness well in storage. It's one of the best storing muscadines I know of. And that all makes it very good for use in commercial packing. The downsides of Supreme, vine vigor is kind of low, and if you overcrop it, and Supreme's odd in that it's a female variety that sets a very heavy crop some years. And so if you get that low vigor and heavy cropping, you can have some real problems getting the vines to survive on the winter season. And you can stunt the vines. And I've seen heavily cropped Supreme vines just killed outright from overcropping. So you got to watch the berry set on them. Berries can split when you pick them, and it's not uncommon to lose a third of the berries to berry split. And one of the reasons for that is that the clusters are very tight, which forces you when you pick it to grab the base of the berry and squeeze and kind of twist it off to yank it out of that cluster. And when you squeeze the berry and yank it, that's very common to get them to split when you do that. Cold hardiness is not good. That's primarily due to that overcropping, I think, but that's a real problem in places like North Carolina. Right now, our recommendation is the size and quality Supreme. Currently, it makes up for its fussy growth habits. It's still worth planting because of those good traits. Watch your crop load on them, and so you don't overcrop the vines. Supreme has a long picking window. You can see it here in these clusters. You got a ripe berry here, and it's right next to one that's still green, and then here's one in Verizon. So you get all different ripening levels of Supreme, which makes it a little bit harder to pick because you got to kind of pick and choose berries to pick. But if you're doing pick your own, it maybe works better because it gives you a long harvest window. Excellent refrigerated storage. If you're picking something, you want to store it and sell at a later date, Supreme's your first choice to put into storage. Polk Muscadine is a recent release that we put out there as to be a potential self-fertile replacement for Supreme. You can see the Polk berries here next to Supreme. Polk is 15 grams. They're a little bit smaller than the very biggest Supreme, but they're more consistent in size than is Supreme. When you look at them, the Polk is a little more purple and Supreme's a little more black. And the lenticels are a little bit more prominent on Polk than Supreme, but I think you could probably pack them together and you probably couldn't tell the difference between the two. Differences between Supreme and Polk, besides the flower type. Polk is not quite as good a storer as Supreme. It goes in the same firmness as Supreme, but when it comes out, it's a little softer usually than Supreme. It's a better picking scar. You very seldom get berry split in Polk. The clusters are much looser. You can grab around the berry near the stem and twist it to pick. And it'll usually come off very clean. So you don't lose as many that way. No early berries though in Polk. They ripen all together in the mid-season and then they're done. You don't have the late berries and you don't have the early berries that you get in Supreme. So in terms of harvesting efficiency, it's better, but in terms of having a longer harvest window, it's not as good. And it doesn't hold on the vine as well as Supreme. Supreme, you can leave ripe berries on the vine a good while and come back later and pick them. The Polk, once they're ripe, they tend to start to upsize from the vine within a week or so, and they get a little bit more fruit rot than does the Supreme. And so you can't really just leave them out there. You got to pretty much pick them when they're ripe. Right now, we're recommending Polk as a potential self-fertile replacement for Supreme, with the idea it picks better and it's got a better vine vigor than does Supreme. But I would not go fully over into Polk until I see how it performs. Like I said, you're not going to get the early berries you get with Supreme, and it's not going to store as well as Supreme. And so it's probably worth still keeping and having Supreme as a variety as well. I'd probably plant no more than equal amounts of Polk with Supreme until you see how it's going to do in your operation. The other ones that I've seen used in black varieties, Delicious and Ison are two which are somewhat similar in my mind. Delicious was released by University of Florida. It's again self-fertile, but it's only medium size, about 10 grams. It can overcrop fairly badly, but the vine vigor is enough that it doesn't hurt the vine when you do that. What you do is when you overcrop them, they're later and your Brix isn't quite as good. It's got kind of a tough skin and a soft pulp, so it's more like an older variety of Muscadine, but it's got pretty good flavor. It's okay for clamshell sales, and that's where I think Polk Vineyards uses it primarily for clamshell. But it's maybe not quite as good for if you wanted to pack them in a box where the consumer's picking out individual berries. Availability of Delicious, I'm not sure what nurseries are carrying Delicious right now. And so that may be a problem with trying to find it. And that's the other reason that I also recommend Ison Muscadine. It's similar to delicious and it's medium sized, 10 gram, self-fertile, pretty vigorous vine. The Muscadine face group people, they really like it in terms of having, it's a good pollinator for female varieties, and it's very consistent year to year and cropping well. Again, a little bit tougher skin and a softer pulp. And it's okay for clamshell sales. I think I like Delicious a little better. I think it has a drier scar than does Ison and a little better flavor. But if you can't find Delicious in the nursery, you may be able to find the Ison variety, which would have a very similar purpose in your vineyard. Then we go into bronze cultivars. Early season, we recommend Hall. Hall was a release from our program, and it was released primarily to replace Terra. Terra is a good vine, vigorous vine, crops well, but the berries sometimes have an off flavor. I've heard it called a diesel flavor or dirty sock flavor. I don't know what the flavor is, but it's not good sometimes. And it's some years you notice it, and some years you don't. And even some days I notice it, some days I don't. But to get away from that off flavor, we used Terra as a parent and selected out of the progeny Hall. Hall has about at least a degree or two better bricks than does Terra. It's early ripening like Terra, so it's coming off late July, early August. Excellent picking scar. Usually we get about 90% or more dry scar on Hall, so that's good about it. The color is a little more yellow than his Terra, and definitely a brighter color than his Triumph, which is another early self-fertile cultivar, which growers were having some trouble getting the stores to accept Triumph because it was getting very pink and dark, and it just looked like an overripe berry. So to get away from that dark color, we selected Hall to be a brighter color in the box. Size is similar to other self-fertile cultivars, about 10 grams. The other one we like early season is Early Fry. It's something that's, it's a female variety and it's much larger than its Hall. You can see it here in the hand. You get some very, very large berries with Early Fry. And it's got a really nice flavor, I think. The downside of it, and berries can be somewhat dirty in appearance. You can see it in the box here and in the hand here. Growers or consumers that are familiar with muscadines know that's what a bronze muscadine often looks like, and they're not put off by that. But consumers that are not as familiar with muscadines maybe wouldn't like that darker appearance. And then productivity can be a problem. We've got very good yields with Early Fry in our vineyards, but we have quite a few self-fertile pollinators, and that may be why. It's something it seems to vary vineyard to vineyard, and you're just gonna have to try and see if the productivity is enough for you. Mid-season cultivars, a lot of people are still growing Fry. That's the old variety. It's what the fresh market industry was based off, this cultivar, and there's still quite a few of these out in our current vineyards. It's female. It's kind of large size, about 13 grams, not quite as big as Supreme. One of the things the growers like about Fry is that you can pick it green and it's still got a good flavor. And so you can pick it when it's not quite ripe, but it's still firm, and get that good flavor. And so you don't get them rejected in the grocery store, but it's still good for the consumer. And so that's a very positive attribute. Productivity varies year to year depending on capstick. Very disease susceptible. So if you get a wet harvest year, you can really lose a lot of Fry. And it can have a wet picking scar. Growers want something different than this. They want a self-fertile main season bronze variety, but we just don't have one right now to replace it with. We get to late season. The two we commonly see used are Late Fry and Granny Val. These are both self-fertile, fairly large for self-fertiles, probably 11 to 12 grams. Fruit rot in Late Fry is an issue. And part of that's just due because it's late and we planted ours in amongst the early varieties. And so our last fungicide goes on in mid-July. And then we're not picking this till the end of August, and that's a long window to have with no fungicide control. And so if you're planting late season bronze varieties as a grower, it's really better if you can plant them in a separate section so that you can keep spraying those a little bit longer than you are your early season and get that fungicide control on them longer. Late fry is a soft berry with a wet scar. And so it's not as good to me for commercial use, but it does have, I think, better flavor than Granny Val. Granny Val is our other late season variety. Very vigorous vine, very productive vine, can actually be overproductive. So you want to watch that, control your crop load. I've found the flavor on Granny Val to be average to poor. It's a little acidic and not quite as much bricks as I would like. And so I don't like the flavor on it, but it does pick a little better. It's a little more disease resistant with a drier scar. And so I'd probably, if I were planting it for commercial use, I'd probably plant that over late fry. Juice cultivars very quickly. It's down to two for most of it. Noble and Carlos are your two big dogs in the industry, and then everything else is pretty much minor players. Noble is a purple wine juice cultivar, and it's grown in North Carolina, it's grown in Georgia, it's grown in Florida. It seems to do well everywhere. Very vigorous, disease-resistant vine. One of the things they like about it as a purple grape is it holds its color better than most other purple muscadines. Purple muscadines tend to brown in their juice when you store them a long time, but Noble holds its color better than most other purple varieties. And so there's one or two other purple juice cultivars out there, but I haven't hardly seen them grown anywhere. There's a little more variability for bronze types, but again, Carlos is by far the main variety used. Extremely vigorous vine, good yielder, fairly dry scar, so it goes off, and when you mechanically shake it, it comes off pretty well. Generally only good for juice. It's too small for fresh market anymore. Fruit rot can be an issue for Carlos, but it's an issue for about any bronze variety. And so while I have seen some people using magnolia and a little bit of welder and some other things, by far the biggest one is Carlos. And your growers need to know that, you know, if they're selling it to juice for somebody else, you need to make sure that whoever you're growing for, if they want Carlos, then you need to grow Carlos. If you're juicing it yourself, then you may have some other, you can experiment with some other varieties, but you need to find out what the person buying it's going to want before you plant anything else besides Carlos and Noble, because some winemakers, they just don't want any other varieties. So we're heading out about the end of the talk here. Information sources, if you Google UGA muscadine breeding, that'll pull up our site. We have some information on the varieties there. And I'm hoping to redo that site this winter. We did some videos in the vineyard this year because of COVID, and we're going to link those videos on the website and try and update some of the information and get it more up to date. So check in there this spring. There should be some more information. And then sources of plants. The two we usually recommend in Georgia are Bottoms Nursery and Ison's Nursery. They seem to have the most volume and varieties available. We have licensed some of our stuff to AgriStarts, but they don't do a ton of muscadine, I don't think. And so you'd have to get with them to know what's available in terms of starts. And they're generally selling them as small tissue culture plants that you would need to probably grow on before putting them in the field. So with that, I'm going to wrap it up and see if there's any questions and go from there.
Do we have any questions? We have time. I saw in the chat that someone said that they had seen several nurseries with Delicious for sale.
Yeah, I think it's probably more common in the Florida nurseries because it was released by Florida. And even though it's not listed on Ison's and Bottoms, I think they may have it available if you ask them as well.
And we have a
Oh, I see that.
Q&A. Okay. Can
What
you open
size are
that?
the juice grapes? Usually they're from 5 to 7 grams, I would say. Usually Noble's a little smaller than Carlos, but definitely another size smaller than are the even the smaller fresh market, even the self-fertile ones will be around 10 grams, whereas your juice typically are no bigger than 7 grams.
I know one of the ones that we promote for Florida homeowners is Southern Home. Is that just really for homeowners?
I haven't seen it planted commercially. It's the homeowners like it, and I like it too because it has bunch grapes in its background, and so its leaf, it's like a maple leaf. It's got a cut pattern to it, and so it's ornamental that way. But the size is a little bit small for the fresh market. It's probably 9 grams max, and so it hasn't been used commercially for that reason. Explain Brix. Brix is the amount of sugar in the grape, and so the higher the Brix, the more sugar. A nice ripe muscadine, I would like to see at least a 16 Brix. 14 is okay, but if you get lower than that, it's not as flavorful. And that varies a bit by who's doing it. If you just squeeze the berry a little bit and get the first juice that comes out, you'll get a real high Brix. We mash the entire berry and squeeze as much juice as possible out like a winery would when we measure Brix, and so our Brix is a little bit lower than typical.
We have 2 questions that are in the chat box, but we've got to wrap this up quickly. Do you have a recommendation for good overall pollinizer for Noble? And what would be the darkest purple variety available for the homeowner?
Okay, Noble does not need a pollinizer. It's self-fertile, so you don't need anything for that. The darkest variety for the homeowner, most of them are pretty black. I mean, the Ison is a very dark variety, and it would be one of the darkest ones, I would think.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Dr. Connor.